Later that evening, as Ryan sits at his sleek, modern desk, he reflects on the strange turn his life has taken. Who would have thought that a small-town baker, someone he'd hardly given a second glance at before, would become the key to his problems? He stares out the window, a plan taking shape in his mind. The marriage would be a business transaction, nothing more, a way to fulfill his grandfather's request without emotional entanglements. But the more he thinks about it, the more Ryan wonders if there's more to this than just a simple arrangement. There's something about Dan that keeps pulling at him, even if he doesn't want to admit it. For now, though, he pushes those thoughts aside. All he has to do is get Dan to agree to the contract marriage, and that would be the first step toward solving all his problems. Ryan sits across from Dan in the quiet bakery, his expression unusually serious. He places a sleek folder on the counter and slides it toward Dan. "I have a solution to all your financial problems," he begins, his voice smooth but insistent. Dan eyes the folder warily, clutching his arms across his chest as if shielding himself. "I'm not interested," he says, already sensing Ryan's intent. Ryan smirks, leaning forward. "Hear me out. It's a simple arrangement, a fake marriage. You pretend to be my fiancé for a few months. In return, I'll pay off your debts and make sure your bakery is financially secure. No strings attached, just business." Dan's eyes narrow. "I'm not going to sell myself for money," he snaps, "and I'm definitely not desperate enough to deceive anyone like that. Find someone else for your little game." Ryan chuckles, the teasing lilt returning to his voice. "You're so stubborn, Dan. It's cute, really." He leans back, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "But you'll see, I'm more stubborn than you." Dan's frustration grows as Ryan continues to visit the bakery day after day, casually flirting, teasing, and pestering him with the same proposal. One day, Dan finally snaps, throwing down a dish towel. "You can keep coming back every day, but my answer will always be the same: no." Ryan's grin widens, unfazed by Dan's resistance. "Good," he says with a smirk, "because I'll keep coming back every day until you say yes." One evening, the door chimes again, and Dan groans, already guessing who it might be. But when he looks up, Ryan's usual smug demeanor is gone. Instead, he looks vulnerable. Ryan walks toward Dan, his steps slow, and then, much to Dan's shock, kneels before him. "Please," Ryan says, his voice low and pleading. "My grandfather is lying in bed, sick. His last wish is to see me married. I wouldn't ask you if it weren't important." Dan is taken aback, unsure how to respond to the sight of the ever-confident Ryan Carter looking so defeated. Guilt and sympathy churn within him. After a long, tense silence, he finally relents. "Fine," Dan mutters, avoiding Ryan's gaze. "I'll do it." Ryan immediately brightens, his usual energy returning. "Ethan!" he calls out. His secretary appears seemingly out of nowhere, holding a folder. Ryan flips open the contract and places a pen in Dan's hand. "Let's make it official." Still unsure if he's making the right decision, Dan hesitates before signing his name. Ryan follows suit, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. "Let's go," Ryan says, handing Dan his copy of the contract. "Go where?" Dan asks, confused. "You'll see," Ryan replies cryptically, leading Dan to his sleek car and opening the door for him. As they drive through the city, Dan keeps peppering Ryan with questions. "Where are we going? And why do I need to come with you now?" Ryan glances at him briefly, smirking. "First stop, getting you some new clothes." "What's wrong with what I'm wearing?" Dan asks, frowning. Ryan doesn't respond, but his smirk deepens. Soon, they pull up to a designer boutique. Inside, the staff greets Ryan like royalty, bowing and addressing him by name. Dan stands awkwardly as Ryan begins pulling items off the racks, barely sparing a glance at the price tags. "Try these," Ryan says, shoving a pile of clothes into Dan's arms and pointing to the fitting room. Dan stares at him incredulously. "You want me to try all of this?" "Yes," Ryan replies, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Now go." Dan reluctantly complies, emerging in outfit after outfit for Ryan's approval. Each time Ryan assesses him with a critical eye, occasionally nodding or shaking his head. After what feels like an eternity, Ryan finally settles on a few selections, paying for them without hesitation. Dan protests, "I can't accept these. Let me pay you back." Ryan grins. "Think of it as a part of the contract. Besides, you'll need to look the part." Reluctantly, Dan agrees, changing into one of the new outfits before they head back to the car. The drive takes them far from the city to a sprawling estate. As they approach, Dan's jaw drops at the sheer magnificence of it. Towering wrought iron gates, adorned with intricate gold filigree, open to reveal a wide cobblestone driveway, winding up a hill. Manicured gardens flank the path, filled with vibrant flowers and marble fountains. At the top of the hill stands the mansion, a gleaming structure of white marble and towering pillars that seems more like a royal palace than a home. "Whose house is this?" Dan asks, still staring in awe. "My family's," Ryan replies casually. Dan's heart sinks. "You brought me to meet your family? You could have at least warned me. I didn't bring anything." Ryan smirks, gesturing to Ethan, who retrieves a box from the car trunk. "Relax. I've got it covered. Just act natural." Dan frowns. "What's in the box? I should at least know what I'm lying about." "Nothing scandalous. Just some medicinal herbs and ginseng for my grandfather," Ryan replies with a grin. Inside, Ryan introduces Dan to his family. His grandfather, the apparent patriarch of the estate, greets them warmly. Dan is confused. Ryan had said his grandfather was sick, but the man seems perfectly fine, even energetic. Ryan's grandfather beams at Dan. "So, this is the one, Ryan? You have excellent taste." Dan stiffens, realizing too late that he's been tricked. He glances at Ryan, who offers nothing but a sly smirk in return. As the evening progresses, Dan does his best to play along, though he occasionally shoots daggers at Ryan with his eyes. The meeting goes surprisingly well, and Ryan's grandfather seems thoroughly charmed by Dan. Before they leave, the older man claps his hands together. "Well, this settles it. I'll have the wedding date fixed immediately." Dan's stomach drops. He glares at Ryan, who only smirks wider. "You tricked me," Dan hisses under his breath. "Welcome to the family," Ryan whispers back, his tone dripping with amusement. "Beside, I didn't trick you. All I did was telling you the half-truth. Grandpa was really lying on bed, but was taking an IV drip because of weakness," he added. Dan sat across from Emma in the bakery, fiddling with his apron strings nervously. After explaining the whirlwind events of the past few days, he expected her to be outraged, or at least concerned. Instead, her reaction was the exact opposite. "I knew it!" Emma practically screamed, clasping her hands together with excitement. "Ryan Carter likes you! I told you it was love at first sight!" Dan rolled his eyes, groaning. "Emma, this isn't a love story. It's just a business deal. Nothing more." Emma grinned knowingly, leaning over the counter. "That's how all the love stories in K-dramas start, Dan. Just you wait. By the end of this, he's going to be head over heels for you." "Stop watching so many dramas," Dan muttered, but a faint blush crept up his cheeks. The weeks before the wedding were nothing short of chaos. Ryan's family sent a seemingly endless stream of gifts to Dan's small apartment. Jewelry, designer suits, fine wines, each package more extravagant than the last. Ryan's parents, especially his mother, were unexpectedly doting. She insisted Dan start calling her Mom, and Ryan's father often dropped by unannounced to check on him. One day, Ryan's grandfather gave Dan a small box containing a family heirloom, a beautifully crafted jade bracelet. "This has been passed down in our family for generations," he said warmly. "Now it belongs to you." Dan's guilt weighed heavier with each passing day. "They don't deserve this," he thought to himself. But every time he tried to express his concerns to Ryan, Ryan would brush him off with a smirk. When the big day finally arrived, Dan was overwhelmed by the sheer extravagance of it all. The venue was a grand cathedral adorned with cascading white roses, golden drapes, and crystal chandeliers. The guest list read like a who's who of society's elite, business tycoons, celebrities, and media moguls. Dan fidgeted nervously in his tailored suit as cameras flashed and reporters buzzed outside the venue. Ryan, on the other hand, looked effortlessly calm and charismatic, playing the role of the doting fiancé with ease. The ceremony was flawless. Ryan held Dan's hand gently, his expression soft as he recited his vows. Dan couldn't help but feel a strange flutter in his chest, though he quickly reminded himself that it was all an act. The reception was no less spectacular. Guests gushed over the couple, and every news outlet covered the wedding in vivid detail. By the next morning, Dan and Ryan were on the front page of every newspaper and even graced the cover of a luxury lifestyle magazine with a photo shoot that captured their love. After the festivities, Dan and Ryan returned to the mansion to spend their first night as a married couple. Their bedroom was as luxurious as everything else in the house, with a massive bed adorned with silk sheets. Ryan rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "You take the bed. I'll sleep on the sofa." Dan raised an eyebrow. "It's fine. You can sleep here. Just don't try anything funny. I have a black belt in karate." Ryan burst into laughter, and for the first time Dan found himself laughing along with him. The tension between them eased, and they both fell asleep peacefully, lying side by side. The next morning they moved into Ryan's sleek, modern penthouse. Though they were officially married, they each had separate rooms. Ryan handed Dan a shiny black credit card as soon as they arrived. "This is for anything you need," Ryan said casually. "Don't hold back." Dan hesitated before taking it. "I don't want to spend your money unnecessarily." Ryan smirked. "Relax. It's not my personal money. Think of it as an extension of the contract." With their arrangement set, life slowly returned to normal. Dan went back to running his bakery, finally free of debt and loan sharks. Ryan, true to his playboy nature, resumed his flirtatious escapades, albeit with more discretion to avoid drawing attention to their marriage. Despite their seemingly separate lives, they crossed paths often. Whether it was Ryan dropping by the bakery unannounced, or Dan catching glimpses of Ryan's softer, hidden side at home, their lives began to intertwine in unexpected ways. Days turned into weeks, and Dan couldn't ignore the subtle shift in his relationship with Ryan. Their small talks over breakfast, Ryan's relentless teasing, and the occasional genuine compliment started to feel natural. Dan found himself laughing at Ryan's playful banter, and even missing him when they were apart. He hated to admit it, but Ryan wasn't just the arrogant playboy he had first met. Beneath the surface, there was a softer, surprisingly thoughtful side, a man who remembered how Dan liked his coffee and insisted on buying flowers for the bakery, just because. One afternoon at the bakery, Dan confided in Emma. "He's different when we're alone," Dan said, absently wiping the counter. "I don't know. He's still annoying, but sometimes I catch myself looking forward to seeing him." Emma grinned knowingly. "Oh, Dan, you're totally falling for him." Dan froze. "What? No way. This is a business transaction. Nothing more." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Sure, keep telling yourself that." One evening, Ryan surprised Dan by taking him out to dinner at an exclusive rooftop restaurant. The ambiance was stunning. Twinkling fairy lights, soft jazz playing in the background, and a panoramic view of the city skyline. As they enjoyed their meal, a voice called out, "Ryan?" Dan turned to see a beautiful woman walking toward their table. Ryan's expression shifted to something Dan couldn't quite place. Was it longing? Shock? Relief? The woman hugged Ryan tightly and kissed his cheek, causing an unexpected pang of jealousy to stir in Dan's chest. "This is Amelia," Ryan introduced, his voice unusually warm. "Amelia, this is Dan." "Oh, so you're the one who got Ryan settled," Amelia said with a teasing smile. Dan forced a polite grin, but the comment stung. Before he could respond, Amelia apologized for interrupting. "Nonsense," Ryan said. "Join us." Dan's heart sank. He masked his disappointment with a bright smile. Yes, please, join us. As Ryan and Amelia caught up, Dan felt increasingly invisible. Their easy laughter and shared memories only amplified the distance he felt. Eventually, he excused himself, mumbling something about needing the restroom. In the quiet of the hallway, Dan splashed cold water on his face, trying to shake off the unease. This is just a contract, he reminded himself. Why do I even care? When he returned, Dan froze. Ryan and Amelia were kissing. His breath hitched, and he quickly ducked behind a nearby wall. Tears welled up in his eyes before spilling over. Why does this hurt so much? He whispered to himself. It's not like this is real. Dan couldn't bear to stay any longer. He texted Ryan, I'm not feeling well. I've gone home. From his hiding spot, he watched as Ryan glanced at his phone, read the message, and then returned his attention to Amelia without replying. The sting of being dismissed cut deep. Dan hurried out of the restaurant, hailing a cab. As the car sped through the city streets, he couldn't hold back his tears. The ache in his chest felt unbearable, like something had shattered inside him. By the time he reached home, Dan was emotionally drained. Curling up on the couch, he buried his face in his hands, letting the weight of the evening crush him. I can't let this happen, he thought bitterly. I can't let myself fall for someone who doesn't care. But deep down he knew it was already too late. The next morning, Dan woke up with a pit in his stomach. He didn't want to face Ryan, not after last night. Getting up early, he decided to sneak out and head to the bakery before Ryan woke up. But as he passed Ryan's room, curiosity got the better of him. Quietly, he cracked the door open to peek inside. His heart sank. The bed was untouched, no sign that Ryan had even come home. The ache from the previous night came flooding back. At the bakery, Dan tried to lose himself in his work, but his mind was elsewhere. Thoughts of Ryan and Amelia consumed him, their kiss replaying in his head like a cruel loop. His hands moved mechanically as he kneaded dough, but his focus was nowhere to be found. By midday, Dan couldn't take it anymore. He flipped the closed sign on the door and decided to take a half day. Dan wandered aimlessly until he found himself at a nearby park. Sitting on a bench under the shade of a tree, he pulled out his phone. No texts, no calls. He opened last night's message to Ryan, the words staring back at him mockingly. Seen. Dan's grip on his phone tightened. He let out a bitter laugh and whispered to himself, What did you expect, Dan? That Ryan would care? That he'd suddenly fall for you? Keep dreaming. The voice in his head was relentless. You're nothing more than a tool to make his grandfather happy. Once this contract is over, he'll discard you like he does everyone else. Dan felt a lump rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down. He refused to cry in public. Returning home that afternoon, Dan found the silence in the penthouse deafening. Ryan was still not back. He thought about calling him, but the fear of being ignored again stopped him. Instead, he decided to bake, his trusted escape from all things troubling. He had just placed a tray of cookies into the oven when the doorbell rang. A flicker of hope ignited in his chest. Is it Ryan? But when he opened the door, it was Ethan. Dan tried to mask his disappointment. Ethan, what brings you here? Ethan handed over some documents for Ryan. Dan hesitated before blurting out, Can I ask you something? Ethan raised an eyebrow but nodded. Who is Amelia? Ethan's expression turned unreadable. That's not for me to say, he replied curtly. You should ask Ryan. Dan's shoulders slumped. I figured you'd say that. It was nearly 8 p.m. when the front door finally opened. Ryan strolled in, looking as nonchalant as ever. Dan stood in the kitchen, finishing up a tray of Ryan's favorite dessert. He waited, hoping for some acknowledgement, an explanation, anything. But all Ryan said was, Hi, before heading straight to his room. Dan's jaw clenched in frustration. He placed the dessert tray on the counter with more force than necessary. After last night, All he says is, "Hi? Seriously?" He turned off the kitchen lights and retreated to his own room. Lying on his bed, Dan stared at the ceiling. His emotions were a tangled mess. Anger, sadness, and a painful longing he couldn't shake. "Get it together, Dan," he muttered to himself. "This is just a contract, nothing more. Remember that." But deep down he wished it were something more. Dan stood by the stove, frying eggs while the coffee machine hummed in the background. His movements were mechanical, lacking his usual energy. Ryan entered, stretching lazily, his footsteps echoing softly in the quiet kitchen. "Morning," Ryan said casually, grabbing a mug for coffee. Dan glanced at him briefly, his expression unreadable. "Morning," he replied, turning back to the stove. Ryan frowned. Something felt off. He leaned on the counter, trying to catch Dan's eye. "You're up early. Trouble sleeping?" "Busy day ahead," Dan said curtly, sliding an egg onto his plate and sitting at the table, his back partially turned to Ryan. Ryan tried again, forcing a light laugh. "You're acting like I bite. Did I do something to piss you off?" Dan didn't look up. "I don't know, Ryan. Did you?" The tension thickened, and Ryan stood there, unsure how to respond. Dan's silence filled the space, leaving Ryan with more questions than answers. At the bakery, Dan threw himself into his work with unusual intensity, kneading dough as though it had personally offended him. Customers came and went, but he barely noticed, his mind racing with memories of Ryan and Amelia. When his phone buzzed, he hesitated before glancing at the screen. "Ryan, how's your day going?" Dan stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. Finally, he locked the screen and shoved the phone into his pocket. He didn't have the energy to pretend everything was fine. By late afternoon, he was mentally exhausted. "Closed for the day," he muttered, flipping the sign on the bakery door. Dan slumped onto a park bench, the crisp breeze tugging at his hair. He was scrolling aimlessly on his phone when Emma's voice broke through his thoughts. "You look like someone stole your last cupcake," she teased, plopping down beside him. "Not now, Emma," Dan sighed, rubbing his temples. She frowned. "Hey, what's going on? You've been acting weird all week." "It's nothing," he muttered. Emma narrowed her eyes. "Don't lie to me. Is it Ryan?" Dan stiffened but said nothing. "Oh my God, it is Ryan!" she exclaimed, her voice filled with curiosity and concern. "What did that playboy do now?" "It's not what you think," Dan said quickly. "It's just, I guess I thought we were starting to connect, but then—" He trailed off, looking away. "Dan," Emma said softly, "are you falling for him?" He shook his head vehemently. "No, it's just a contract. I'm just overthinking things." Emma gave him a skeptical look but didn't press further. "If you say so," she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't convinced. Ryan paced his office, running a hand through his hair. "I don't get it," he muttered. "One minute everything's fine, and the next, he's freezing me out." Ethan, sitting across from him, raised an eyebrow. "Maybe it's something you did." Ryan scowled. "Like what?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I don't know. Maybe something to do with Amelia." Ryan pauses, his brows furrowing. "Amelia? What about her?" Ethan leans back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Dan asked me about her the other day. Seemed curious. Almost jealous." Ryan groaned. "Amelia's just a friend. Why would he care? It's not like... We're not even... He stopped, frowning at his own hesitation. Ethan smirked knowingly. "Maybe you should ask yourself why you care so much." Back at the bakery, Dan sat at the counter, his hands clasped tightly together. His phone buzzed again, and he hesitated before unlocking it. "Ryan, are we okay?" The text was simple, but it cut deep. Dan reread it several times before closing the message. He couldn't bring himself to reply. His inner voice mocked him. "What did you expect, Dan? That Ryan would fall head over heels for you? Get real. You're just a means to keep his grandpa happy." The thought made his chest ache, but he swallowed the pain and busied himself with cleaning the already spotless counter. That evening, Ryan found Dan in the living room, scrolling through a cookbook. "Hey," Ryan started, his tone tentative. Dan glanced up briefly. "Hey." Ryan sat down across from him, watching Dan flip through the pages. "I was thinking we could do something tomorrow. Maybe grab dinner or—" "I'm busy," Dan interrupted, not looking up. Ryan frowned. "You don't even know what time I was going to suggest." Dan closed the book and stood up. "Like I said, I'm busy." Without another word, he walked to his room, leaving Ryan sitting there, frustrated and confused. "Dan, this isn't healthy," Emma said over the phone. "You're miserable, and he clearly has no idea what's going on." "I can't," Dan said. "What if I tell him, and he just laughs it off? Or worse, what if he pities me?" Emma sighed. "You're overthinking. Just talk to him. You'll feel better." Dan shook his head, even though she couldn't see him. "No, I'll get over it. I just need time." The next morning, Dan found a small box on the counter with a note. "I'm sorry. Hope this makes up for whatever I did." Inside were his favorite pastries from a high-end bakery. Dan stared at the box for a moment before pushing it aside. He appreciated the gesture, but it felt hollow compared to the hurt he carried. When Ryan saw the untouched box later, his frown deepened. That evening, Ryan finally cornered Dan in the living room. "We need to talk," he said firmly. Dan sighed. "Ryan, I'm tired. Can we not do this right now?" "No," Ryan said, stepping in front of him. "You've been avoiding me all week. Just tell me what's wrong." Dan hesitated, his walls crumbling just a little. "It's nothing. I'm fine." Ryan crossed his arms. "You're a terrible liar, Dan." Dan almost blurted out the truth, but stopped himself. "Good night, Ryan," he said softly before retreating to his room. Ryan stood there, watching him go, frustration and guilt warring in his chest. Dan and Ryan, lying awake in their respective rooms, each lost in their thoughts. Dan wonders if he's making the right choice by keeping his feelings hidden, while Ryan starts to question if he's been blind to something deeper between them all along.